Have you ever noticed how all it takes is one offhand word, a sideways glance, or even a misinterpreted silence to derail your entire day? It's almost as if the world has a secret button that controls your emotions, and you might not even realize it. But this button isn't in others, it's within you. What no one tells you is that it's not insults, criticism, or other people's anger that hurt you. It's the parts of yourself you haven't yet learned to embrace. The controversy is harsh, but real. As long as you continue to hide your shadow, anyone can use it against you. And that's why criticism often hurts so much, not because it's absolute truth, but because it touches on what you yourself tried to bury. It's the ego that trembles, the persona that cracks, the insecurity that cries out for help. But here's the counterintuitive key. When you learn to look within, the power of others simply dissolves. Think about it. What if the problem wasn't what others say, but how much you depend on it for validation? Carl Jung discovered that true freedom begins the moment you reconcile with what you've always tried to deny. It's at this point that insults become wind and provocations become nothing more than noise. And the reward is swift. From the moment you understand this secret, you no longer need to fight the world to feel at peace. You no longer need to win debates, prove your worth, or react to every provocation. Everything changes because the center becomes yours, and nothing external can steal what has already been integrated within you. Now, if you think this is just fancy theory, wait until you discover how every criticism can become a mirror, how the shadow projects what bothers you most, and why the other person's anger almost never speaks of you. This is where the turning point begins, and perhaps it's exactly the turning point you're looking for. The invisible mechanism that turns criticism into mirrors of the unconscious. When someone criticizes us, our first reaction is almost always defensive. Our ego inflates, creating quick justifications and trying to escape the feeling of being exposed. But according to Carl Jung, criticism isn't just an opinion thrown into the wind. It acts as a mirror of the unconscious. What the other person says may not be entirely true, but it touches something deep within us that we already suspected existed. It's like when someone says you're proud, and even if you don't want to admit it, you feel that uncomfortable pang, not because the other person said it, but because it resonated with something already latent in your own shadow. This invisible mechanism occurs because we carry parts of ourselves that we hide behind our persona. We constantly show the world what we deem most acceptable and socially approved, while burying the traits we consider shameful or fragile. And that's precisely where shadow work comes in. Every criticism we receive can reveal what we try to deny. Consider, for example, when someone points out your impatience. If you feel deeply irritated, perhaps it's not just the other person's words that bother you, but the unconscious memory of how many times you've condemned yourself for being impatient. It's interesting to note that this process doesn't depend on the other person's intention. Often, the person criticizing isn't even aware of the impact it will have. However, in the field of spirituality, we understand that nothing happens by chance. Every word, every look, and even every misunderstanding can be an invitation to see what was previously hidden. It's as if the universe uses the other person as a spokesperson for their unconscious. A practical example: when a coworker says, "You don't know how to work in a team," and this destabilizes you, perhaps it's time to reflect on whether you yourself have difficulty trusting others. If we observe calmly, we'll see that this mechanism can be used as a tool for individuation. Instead of reacting immediately, we can stop and ask ourselves, why did this affect me so much? What does this criticism reveal about my relationship with my own ego? Turning criticism into a mirror requires courage, but it's liberating. A simple exercise is to write down the criticism that hurts most, then reflect, what does this phrase evoke in me? Where have I heard this before? Could this wound stem from childhood, a romantic relationship, or a memory I'd rather forget. The curious thing is that when we begin to understand this mechanism, life becomes less burdensome. Criticism ceases to be a personal attack and becomes a source of self-discovery. This doesn't mean accepting insults in silence, but learning to use each word as a key to open internal doors. This is the first step to understanding why, often, the other person's anger rarely speaks about you per se, but rather about projections and mirrors that each human being carries within. And this is precisely where the next lesson begins. Why other people's anger almost never talks about you. Anger is a strange force. It explodes like a wildfire, but it almost always stems from an internal fuse that has nothing to do with the person in front of it. Carl Jung once said that what we most condemn in others is usually a reflection of what we reject in ourselves. When someone becomes filled with fury and projects a storm of words at you, more often than not, that energy isn't about you, but about internal battles they can't overcome. Their ego, inflated and fragile at the same time, needs an external target to keep from imploding. Consider an everyday example, the boss who yells over the smallest details. At first glance, it seems like the fault was his. But if we look deeper, we realize that his anger carries his own insecurities. Perhaps he himself fears being seen as incompetent and therefore takes it out on the closest employee. In this sense, spirituality invites us to look beyond the surface. It's not the mistake that triggers the outburst, but the archetype of his shadow, screaming for recognition. Anger acts as a smokescreen, hiding the fear of being unmasked. Of course, the ego likes to believe that everything revolves around us. That's why, when we receive a burst of anger, we wonder, what did I do wrong? But shadow work teaches us that often there's nothing in us that needs fixing. The other person's anger is about internal monsters they haven't faced. This doesn't mean ignoring responsibility, but realizing that not every accusation is true. How many times have you seen couples fighting, each accusing the other of flaws that deep down they both harbor? A practical exercise to recognize this is this. The next time someone comes at you with anger, take a deep breath and ask yourself mentally, what does this really have to do with me? Most of the time, the answer will be little or nothing. And if there is anything, it will simply be the mirror of the unconscious as we saw before. This simple pause changes everything because you become an observer, not a hostage. Instead of absorbing the venom, you realize it was never yours, but theirs. And here's the detail few realize. When we understand that another's anger almost never speaks of us, a silent freedom is born. You no longer need to engage in battles that aren't yours. You can choose to respond calmly or simply not respond at all. And it is at this point that an even more profound discovery emerges. The Jungian secret of how the shadow projects precisely what bothers us most, and that indeed is the heart of the matter. The Jungian secret of how the shadow projects what bothers you most. Carl Jung revealed one of the psyche's most uncomfortable secrets. The shadow is not only what we hide, but also what we most easily see in others. What bothers us most in others is often a reflection of something we don't accept within ourselves. It's as if the unconscious uses our eyes as projectors, projecting onto the other person's screen the contents we refuse to accept. Thus, when someone deeply irritates you because they're arrogant, perhaps that arrogance is simply a reminder of how much you yourself fear appearing that way, or how many times you've been called that at some point in your life. This mechanism explains why some criticism seems unfair, yet still hurts so much. The ego can't stand the idea of carrying what it condemns. Therefore, it prefers to believe that the fault is always the other person's. And here, spirituality comes in as a key to understanding. Shadow projection is an unconscious way of asking for internal reconciliation. Imagine, for example, a person who is easily irritated by lazy people. Often, this discomfort stems from the fact that they condemn themselves for every moment of rest, unable to allow themselves to relax. Shadow work emerges precisely as a practice to reclaim these disowned parts. Instead of blaming the world, the person begins to ask, why does this affect me so much? Where is this part of me? It's almost like hunting inner ghosts. A simple exercise is to list the 3 behaviors that most trigger anger or judgment in you. Then look within and identify where these behaviors also manifest, even if in small doses. This process is uncomfortable, but therein lies the opportunity for growth. Interestingly, this projection doesn't just occur with negative traits. Jung also noted that we project light. Sometimes we admire someone so much for their courage or authenticity because we forget to recognize these qualities in ourselves. But when it comes to shadow, the projection is often louder. Just look at social media. The most vitriolic and aggressive comments reveal less about the target and more about the writer. It's the unconscious exposing its wound to the world. Understanding this Jungian secret completely changes the way we react to relationships. It stops being a matter of accusing or defending and becomes an opportunity for self-reflection. The question is no longer, why is so-and-so like this? But why does this bother me so much? And with each answer, a part of the shadow is embraced. It is at this point that we begin to glimpse the stark difference between reacting and responding. And this can be the turning point between repeating old patterns or choosing a new way of living. The brutal difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is instinct, responding is awareness. This is the stark difference that separates those who live enslaved by their ego from those who learn to walk hand in hand with their own spirituality. When someone provokes us, the immediate impulse is to react, raise our voice, justify ourselves, attack back. It's the ego on autopilot, driven by the desire for protection. Responding, however, is a different game. It requires pause. It requires presence. It requires shadow work. The response arises not from the need to defeat the other, but from remaining true to oneself. It's like choosing to be the conductor of one's own inner orchestra, rather than letting each instrument play alone in desperation. Carl Jung said that nothing is more dangerous than an uncontrolled unconscious, and it's precisely in the difference between reacting and responding that we see this clearly. Those who react surrender the reins of their being to any external stimulus. Those who respond take command. Consider a simple example. You're driving, someone abruptly cuts you off in traffic. Reacting would mean honking, cursing, or speeding up behind them. Responding would mean taking a deep breath, realizing it's not worth wasting your vital energy on an ego clash, and moving on. It seems small, but this detail changes the emotional fate of an entire day. Responding doesn't mean being passive. Quite the opposite. It requires strength. The archetype that comes into play here is that of the wise man, the one who observes before acting. At work, for example, when a colleague criticizes you in front of everyone, the reaction would be to retort in kind, trying to defend yourself. The response, on the other hand, might be to wait for the right moment and calmly offer your perspective. This not only preserves your energy, but also exposes the fragility of the attack. Silence, in these cases, is the sharpest sword. A practical exercise to practice this distinction is to create a pause ritual. Before responding to any criticism or provocation, count to 10 mentally. This space, however small, allows the unconscious to reveal where the pain comes from and prevents the ego from taking over. Another powerful practice is writing. When you feel the urge to react, write down exactly what you would say. Then reread it calmly and see if that is the version of yourself you want to show the world. Often just this act of writing dissolves the weight of anger. The brutality of this difference reveals itself over time. Those who constantly react end up exhausted, poisoned by battles they didn't need to fight. Those who learn to respond achieve a peace that can't be bought. And here opens the portal to something even more subtle, the silent power of not feeding another's ego. Because deep down, many attacks only exist because they hope to be fed. And when you offer nothing, the fire simply dies out. The silent power of not feeding someone else's ego. Few people realize, but many conflicts only survive because they are fueled. The ego of others is strengthened when it encounters resistance, when someone responds in kind, when provocation generates exactly the expected reaction. Carl Jung said that the unconscious seeks compensation. If a person can't deal with their own shadow, they dump it on others to feel less burdened. But this game only works if there's someone willing to carry that baggage. When you choose not to react, you're actually cutting off the energy supply that keeps the other person's war alive. It's like a fire. There's no point in adding fuel if the intention is to put it out. Every time you respond to a provocation just to prove you're right, you reinforce the ego structure that craved that very validation. Have you ever tried to remain silent in front of someone who expected you to explode? It's disconcerting. The other person loses their footing because the scene they rehearsed in their head doesn't play out. This is the silent power of not giving food. You shatter the other person's narrative without needing a single word. In spirituality, this act is compared to withdrawing from the invisible battlefield. It doesn't signify cowardice, but maturity. It's like when someone launches a venomous criticism and you choose to smile lightly, change the subject, and move on. The other person's ego expected a war, but found only serenity. This attitude not only disarms the attacker, but also strengthens your own individuation, as it shows that you don't need to prove anything to anyone to exist. Silence, in this case, is more powerful than any speech. A practical exercise to practice this is to observe, for a week, every situation in which someone tried to poke your ego. It could be in traffic, at work, or even at home. Instead of responding automatically, try simply taking a deep breath and not reacting. Then, note how the other person behaved and, most importantly, how you felt. Little by little, you'll notice that the burden lifts, because what isn't nourished dies. This practice is one of the pillars of shadow work, as it shows how true strength lies not in defeating the other, but in overcoming one's own need for recognition. This silent power not only diffuses conflicts, but also opens space for something even deeper, transforming attacks into fuel for individuation. After all, if the other person encounters no resistance, you're left with only the opportunity to look within and ask, what does this awaken in me that hasn't yet been resolved? It's in this crack of silence that true transformation begins. How to turn attacks into fuel for individuation. The ego's instinct is simple. When attacked, it defends itself. When wounded, it counterattacks. But spirituality shows us an unexpected and even counterintuitive path, using attack not as a source of suffering, but as a trigger for growth. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the journey in which a human being integrates their shadow and reconnects with the self. Every criticism, every offense, and every sidelong glance can be raw material for this inner work. The secret lies in realizing that what arrives from outside is only powerful because it has found something within. Imagine someone who is constantly called weak. If that word hurts more than it should, perhaps it's because there's an old wound planted in childhood when they heard similar phrases. The current attack only reignites the fire that was already burning beneath the skin. Shadow work teaches how to transform this pain into a tool. Instead of denying or reacting, the person can look at the memory, embrace the feeling, acknowledge the fragility, and then integrate this part of the psyche. It is in this process that the attack becomes fuel, as it points directly to where the soul craves attention. In practice, this movement can be practiced with simple but profound questions. What exactly hurt me in that statement? Where does this sensitivity come from? What haven't I resolved within myself that makes this criticism so heavy? Writing these reflections in a journal can be transformative. It's not just catharsis, but a way to dialogue with the unconscious. Rereading it after a few days, hidden patterns that previously went unnoticed emerge. It's like deciphering a secret code that's always been there, begging to be revealed. Another essential point is to realize that attacks also act as unwitting teachers. Difficult people, authoritarian bosses, critical family members, all of them unknowingly offer us daily invitations to practice shadow integration. It's hard to admit, but psychologically, even aggressors play a role in our maturation process. Of course, this doesn't mean accepting abuse, but understanding that even in the most uncomfortable friction, there is material for individuation. As Jung says, what we deny controls us, but what we accept transforms us. Gradually, this perspective completely changes the relationship with the world. What was once seen as an offense becomes an opportunity. What seemed like an attack becomes a guide. And each painful experience becomes a concrete step on the path to the self. At this point, the psyche discovers something fascinating. True strength doesn't need to impose itself because it's already rooted. And it is precisely here that the archetype of the serene warrior begins to reveal itself. That strength that doesn't need to shout to be recognized. The serene warrior archetype. Strength that doesn't need to shout. The serene warrior is a powerful image within the archetypes. It represents strength that doesn't depend on noise, authority that doesn't need to prove anything. While the ego seeks external recognition, the serene warrior finds legitimacy in silence. Carl Jung showed that this archetype emerges when the individual has already traveled part of the journey of individuation, integrating aspects of the shadow and dissolving the childish need for approval. It's a force that inspires not by shouting, but by presence. Anyone who has been around someone like this knows all it takes is for the person to enter the room and the energy changes. In spirituality, this archetype is associated with those who have learned to transform attacks into learning experiences. They don't see enemies around every corner because they understand that the greatest battles take place within themselves. Shadow work has taught them that fighting others is often just a disguise to escape their own internal war. The serene warrior doesn't waste energy trying to prove themselves right. Their greatest weapon is clarity, and their greatest defense is self-control. A practical example? Consider historical leaders who were known for their serenity. Nelson Mandela, for example, endured years in prison and, upon his release, could have reacted with hatred. But he chose to respond calmly, building a path of reconciliation. This is the archetype in action. Strength lay not in clenched fists, but in the inner firmness that refused to be shaped by resentment. The serene warrior inspires because he shows that true victory is not in crushing others, but in remaining true to oneself, despite everything. In everyday life, anyone can practice this archetype. Just observe the moments when the ego wants to shout to be heard. In a family argument, for example, the impulse is to raise your voice to command respect. But what if, instead, you keep your tone low, firm, and calm? Often the impact will be greater because conscious silence cuts deeper than shouting. The serene warrior is not passive, but strategic. They know that the energy saved today is strength saved for when they really need to act. By cultivating this posture, a state of silent power is born that no one can steal. And here, the next layer of the path is revealed. When the serene warrior masters his own center, he discovers why he can never be manipulated. After all, those who don't need to shout also don't need to bow because their strength comes from within, not from external approval. Why those who master their own center can never be manipulated. Manipulation only works when there's a gap, and this gap almost always stems from ego insecurity. Carl Jung said that those who don't know themselves live at the mercy of others' projections, believing in compliments that inflate their persona or criticism that feeds their shadow. Those who master their own center, however, don't depend on this ebb and flow. They don't get lost in extremes. They don't become slaves to caresses or attacks. Their spirituality has given them such firm roots that no outside opinion can tear them away. This center isn't some distant mystical concept. It's practical, it's tangible. It's the moment you recognize your weaknesses and therefore no one can use them against you. Imagine someone trying to manipulate you by calling you proud. If you've ever faced this aspect within yourself during shadow work, that word has no power. It's like trying to light a wet match. It won't catch fire. The center is exactly that, the awareness of who you are, unafraid to look into your own inner mirrors. A practical example is abusive relationships. Manipulators often use emotional blackmail, promising love in exchange for submission. Those who don't master their own inner core give in because they fear abandonment. But those who have already walked the path of individuation understand that the value of their existence doesn't depend on anyone's approval. Thus, manipulation loses its effect. This is the power of those who don't sell themselves for crumbs of attention, because they've discovered they already carry the whole loaf within themselves. Training this state is like strengthening a muscle. It starts with small gestures, saying no when something doesn't make sense, even at the risk of displeasing others, maintaining silence when you're expected to react, choosing for yourself instead of following the crowd. Each time you do this, you strengthen the muscles of the self, and little by little, you become immune to external manipulation. The center isn't built overnight, but rather through choice after choice, through internal confrontation after internal confrontation. And it's at this point that life takes on a new texture. Insults, blackmail, and power plays simply lose their force. You become like a rock in a storm. You may even be battered by the water, but you won't budge. It's then that the next stage of this journey reveals itself, a psychological state in which insults become irrelevant, as they no longer find fertile soil in which to germinate. The psychological state in which insults become irrelevant. There's a point in the individuation process where words lose their power to hurt. Carl Jung described this state as a deep integration between ego, persona, and shadow, when the human being no longer relies so heavily on external validation to exist. At this level, insults begin to sound like distant echoes. You hear them, but you can no longer find within yourself the place where they once would have echoed. It's as if the unconscious has closed the gaps. Those who reach this point discover a rare freedom, that of no longer being a prisoner of other people's opinions. In spirituality, this state is compared to being at the center of a whirlpool, yet remaining untouched. The winds swirl, the screams echo, but the core remains serene. The ego, which once rushed to defend itself from any criticism, no longer feels the need to prove anything. The persona, which once sought to please, is no longer a mandatory mask, and the shadow, once hidden, has now been embraced. This balance creates a kind of psychic immunity. The external poison no longer finds a home. Consider a simple example. Someone calls you selfish. If that word hurts, it's because there's still an open wound regarding that issue. But if you've already investigated through shadow work the moments when you were truly selfish and at the same time recognized that everyone has the right to take care of themselves, that insult dissolves into thin air. It doesn't stick. It's like trying to stick a sticker to a wet surface. It simply won't stick. The psychological state here isn't indifference, it's maturity. Reaching this stage doesn't mean becoming cold or insensitive. On the contrary, it's quite the opposite. It means having such clarity about who you are that external noise doesn't alter your essence. This can be practiced in small situations. When someone offers veiled criticism, instead of justifying yourself, look internally. Ask yourself, does this still resonate with me? If so, there's something to work on. If not, you're already savoring this silent freedom. Gradually, this practice spreads to all areas of your life. And it is in this inner silence that Jung's most fascinating paradox occurs. When you embrace your own shadow, nothing external can hurt you, because there are no longer any inner secrets to be used against you. The world can say whatever it wants, but you already know who you are. And so pain becomes a portal, criticism a mirror, and the wound becomes strength. The Jungian paradox. When you embrace your own shadow, nothing external can hurt you. Carl Jung left us a teaching that seems contradictory at first glance. The more you accept yourself, the more immune you become to external judgment. The paradox lies precisely here. What you fear most within yourself, your impulses, your shame, your secrets, is what most empowers the world's attacks. But when you embrace your own shadow, the insults lose their effect. If someone tries to humiliate you for something you've already recognized within yourself, there's no wound to open. The other's power dissolves because it finds nowhere to hold on. This acceptance isn't simple. It requires courage to face the ego without masks, to tear apart the persona that sustains appearances, and to accept that we all carry contradictory archetypes: the hero and the coward, the wise and the fool, the altruist and the selfish. Spirituality calls this a process of integration. The more parts of yourself you bring together, the less room there is for manipulation. The shadow ceases to be a hidden enemy and becomes an ally. It's as if you're saying to yourself, I am this too, and there's no harm in admitting it. In practice, the Jungian paradox can be seen in everyday situations. Imagine someone calling you arrogant. If you spend your life trying to maintain the persona of perfectly humble, it will hurt like a knife. But if you've already acknowledged that, yes, you have been arrogant at times, that this trait exists in you as in any human being, the accusation simply loses its venom. What was once offensive becomes merely a neutral, almost irrelevant observation. This process also transforms relationships. People who have embraced their shadows don't easily fall for power plays, emotional blackmail, or provocations. They don't need to react to prove who they are, because they already know. It's the psychological state of someone who has undergone deep shadow work. Individuation at this level creates an invisible shield. It's not indifference, but serenity, the ability to be whole without depending on external approval. And herein lies the beauty of the paradox. The more you accept the darkness within yourself, the more light radiates outward. What seemed like weakness becomes strength. What seemed like a flaw becomes a learning experience. And what seemed like a wound becomes a portal. At this point, what anyone says no longer matters, because nothing external can penetrate the solidity of someone who has made peace with their own soul. And it is precisely this psychological secret that paves the way for the video's promise, never again to be affected by others. So now that you've made it through this journey, the question is simple. What will you do with all this? Will you continue to let other people's egos dictate the pace of your life, or will you finally choose to take control of your own center? Because, in the end, insults, criticism, and provocations only have power if you hand over the key. What if, starting today, every attack were transformed into a mirror? What if, instead of reacting, you responded with serenity? Have you ever imagined what it would be like to live without the weight of external opinions, free from manipulation, and with the shadow integrated by your side? This is not just a philosophical idea, it is a practical path, and it is open before you now. I want to challenge you. What still within you empowers others? What part of your shadow do you insist on hiding, and that therefore becomes a weapon others use against you? Change begins when you face these questions without fear, because when you do, nothing external can hurt you anymore. If this content resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Apply it to your life. Observe the small situations in your daily life and realize how your attitude can change everything. And remember, transformation doesn't happen in absolute silence. It happens in movement, in practice, in today's decisions. Now I extend a direct invitation to you. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join me on this journey of self-discovery and deep spirituality. Because here you'll find much more than answers. You'll find keys to never again be a prisoner of other people's opinions.